When it comes to rounding over corners, sanding down to a line, or taking the edge off of a miter, disc sanders are about the handiest tool in the shop. And for about $25, you can build your own drill-powered disc sander that folds up and you can take with you to the park, to Taco Bell, to the movies. The most important part of this build is the disc that the sandpaper attaches to. I cut a disc a little over 8 inches, chiseled out a recess for the bolt to fit through, put the bolt in place, and then made sure to cover the top of the shaft and the head with epoxy very, very well. Then drove it in with my hammer, and I drove it in a little bit below the surface so there wouldn't be anything protruding through. And here's where taking a little time makes a big difference later. Using a small square, I went around many different places and just put a little pressure on this until that bolt was lined up as close to 90 as I could possibly get it. And while that was drying, I went and cut out the rest of the parts. Now there's only 3 parts in this whole build that have contours. So after I cut all the parts out, the rough sizes, I went over and did the contoured parts next. I laid out the contours with my compass. Now that crazy looking compass I'm using is actually called an AccuScribe and does a lot more than just lay out circles. With that done, I went over to the bandsaw and cut out the shapes. And then use that as a pattern to mark out the last contour and cut it out on the bandsaw as well. Before I took it over to the bandsaw to cut it out, I marked the center so I wouldn't have to worry about it later. Now with that cut out, I just glued those 2 pieces together, and I tacked the top one in place with a 23 gauge brad nail just to kind of hold it there while I'm clamping it down. And that's actually going to be the housing for the bearings. So while the glue was drying, I went over and started working on the box. Now because I don't like drilling holes more than twice, I just glued this thing together with 2P10 CA gel and activator, and then I came back and I used a countersink to countersink the screws. Now this has to be done because I'm using 1/2 inch plywood for most of this build, and just running a screw into it would just split it. So again, with that part of the box made, I'm just going to glue it to the base, and I use a little 1-inch piece as a spacer, and that kind of gives me a position. Now I left the one side loose so it would move back and forth so I can put the back into it after I'd finished working on it. So after gluing a 1-inch riser to the back, I got the piano hinge out that makes this whole thing fold, and then I marked out the length on it. Now you can cut that with a hacksaw or with a angle grinder with the metal cutter on it. I happen to have a metal bandsaw, so I use that. And this is kind of a cool little tip. Whenever you're putting on a piano hinge, or any hinge really, if you just super glue it in place, it makes it a lot easier to get the screws in the right positions. Now here's a tip for you. Don't put the piano hinge on backwards like I just did. So I pulled it off, cleaned it up, and now I'm installing it the right way. So once that's tacked down with CA gel, I just come through and I pre-tap a couple small holes and then run the screws in by hand. And that's just going to keep me from having to reach inside the box and try to put those screws in after this whole thing's put together. So I moved on to installing the back. It took a few minutes to make sure that this thing was in the right position and it was at a perfect 90-degree angle. That little mag square comes in handy. I use it more than any other square in my shop. And then I tacked it all together with some 2P10 and CA gel activator, and then countersunk a bunch of holes and screwed it all together so it wouldn't move around. And then I just drilled a little hole in the back that I could hang it on later. Next, I took the bearing housing and I marked out all the holes. Now I didn't put any holes in this until I had the body made, that way I can use that to mark out all the positions that I needed. And here I'm just making sure that my bearing is not going to interfere or get in the way with the housing. And then went over to my drill press and drilled out some holes that will receive a T-nut. Then I countersunk it a little bit so I could add screws and the screws wouldn't stick up past the plywood. And then I drilled out the center hole. Now with that done, I need to drill a position for the bearing. So this is going to be all the way through, and I use a 1 3/8 bit. And if you don't have a drill press, you can still build this. Just drill the hole through by hand from the front down. Put the bearing in the front. And then create a flange like that for the back side, and then put your bearing in the flange. So if the hole isn't straight perfect 90, what you can do is you slide the flange with the bearing in it over the back, and then you can adjust the flange. You can move it up and down or back and forth to make sure that that disc is nice and parallel with the bearing housing. And that's an easy way to do it if all you have is a hand drill. Then I installed the T-nuts and bolted the bearing housing to the box with the knobs that hold it in place. And I did that before I put the screws in for the hinge. And that's just going to make sure that when it folds down and comes back up, it's going to be in the right position. So when you're installing the disc, you need to add pressure or preload the bearings. So I just use a clamp and a long socket to put pressure on the stop collar before tightening down the threaded insert. With that done, I moved on to the table bed itself. Now this needs to be in a hinge position as well because it's going to open up, allowing the whole assembly to fold into itself. And I just did that with some screws. I didn't do anything fancy there. Now with everything assembled, it was time to true up the disc wheel. Now I just used a sharp chisel, came in from the side and cleaned it up so it was a nice perfect round. And then the face had a little tiny bit of a wobble to it, so I just used a chisel going back and forth, very light passes and slowly, and cleaned that up. With my drill powered disc sander build complete, I folded it up just to make sure everything fit, and it did, and now it was time to try it out. I drilled a small hole in the side I could use for dust collection, attached my shop vac, grabbed some 3/4 inch plywood and gave it a go. Now this thing ate right through 3/4 inch plywood, and I'm using 120 grit disc sandpaper, and then this little disc sander ate right through hard maple. So happy with the results of this build and the way this little drill powered disc sander is performing. Now if you'd like to build one for yourself, I do have detailed plans available on my website, and there's a link in the description box below. And if you're not subscribed to my channel, I'd invite you to do so. There's always something fun, wild, or crazy happening here on Think Woodworks. Thank you very much for watching.